Learning objectives. After completing this module, learners will be able to understand the influence of three different schools of opinion: liberals, radicals, and conservatives in Europe. Understand and describe the industrial society and social changes taking place in Russia. Describe the advent of socialism in Europe. Understand and describe how France abolished monarchy to become a republic. Understand and describe the Russian Revolution, its economy and society. Understand and explain socialism in Russia. Understand and describe the 1905 Russian Revolution, World War I, and Russian Empire. Understand and explain the February Revolution 1917 and the April Theses of Lenin. Understand and explain the October Revolution 1917. Understand and explain the Civil War. Understand and explain Stalinism and collectivization. Understand in depth the global influence of the Russian Revolution and the USSR. Socialism in Europe and Russian Revolution. The French Revolution gave an idea of how the society could be restructured. It gave rise to three different schools of thought: the liberals, the radicals, and the conservatives in Europe. Liberals wanted a nation tolerant of all religions. They were opposed to concentration of power in dynasties. They favored protection of individual rights and a representative, elected parliamentary government. Yet they were not democrats, as they felt only propertied men should have a vote to write. Radicals wanted a government based on the majority of the population. They did not oppose ownership of private property, but were against the concentration of property in a few hands. Conservatives, though against the idea of a change in society in the 18th century, agreed by 19th century that some change was required: industrial society and social change. With industrialization, men, women, and children thronged to factories to work, but the working hours were long and wages were poor. Unemployment was widespread. Many among the liberals and radicals were property owners and employers who were opposed to privileges by birth. They strongly believed that the society would develop if the workforce benefited through industrialization. The coming of socialism to Europe. The socialists considered private property to be the root cause of all evils. They were of the belief that capitalists who were concerned with their own profits and not with the welfare of workers who made the property productive. Socialists wanted society as a whole to control properties so that social interests could be served. Some socialists believed in the idea of cooperatives, while some opined that it was not possible to build large-scale cooperatives by individual initiatives. Hence, the governments should encourage cooperatives. Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883, and Friedrich Engels, 1820 to 1895, believed that to get rid of capitalist exploitation, workers needed to construct a radically socialist society where all property was socially controlled. This would be a communist society. Support for socialism. Socialist ideas gained popularity in Europe by 1870. Socialists formed an organization called Second International to spread their ideas. Workers in England and Germany had started to form associations to demand better living and working conditions. They set up funds to help members in a crisis. They demanded lesser working hours and rights to vote. These associations worked closely with Social Democratic Party (SDP) in Germany and helped it to win parliamentary seats. By 1905, socialists and trade unionists had formed a Labour Party in Britain and a Socialist Party in France. Despite these developments, the socialists failed to form a government in Europe till 1914. The Russian Revolution. The fall of monarchy in February 1917 and the events that followed in October 1917 are called the Russian Revolution. The Russian Empire in 1914. Russia and its empire was ruled by Tsar Nicholas II in 1914. The Russian Empire, along with regions around Moscow, included modern-day Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, parts of Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus. It stretched up to the Pacific and comprised modern-day Central Asian states, as well as Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Orthodox Christianity was the major religion, but Catholics, Protestants, Muslims, and Buddhists also lived in the Russian Empire. Economy and society. In the beginning of the 20th century, a majority of Russians were agriculturists. Industries were private properties of industrialists. Most of the industries were set up in 1890s. Workers were divided into different social groups, but they united against their employers to express resentment. Peasants had no respect for the nobility. Sometimes they would even murder the landlords. Russian peasants would pool their land and let their commune divide it according to the needs of the individual families. Socialism in Russia. All political parties were illegal in Russia before 1914. The Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party, founded in 1898, believed that since Russian peasants divided their land periodically, they were natural socialists. Hence, peasants, not workers, would be the driving force of the revolution. But Lenin argued that with some peasants rich and some poor, the peasants were not a united group. The party got divided on this issue and split into Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, and Mensheviks. Turbulent time. The 1905 revolution. Russia was an autocracy. The Tsar was not subjected to parliament. To put an end to this autocracy, the liberals, together with social revolutionists, Social Democrats, peasants and workers, demanded constitution. In 1904, the prices soared so steeply that the real wages declined by 20%. At this time, 4 members of the Putilov Iron Works were dismissed. In protest, over 110,000 workers in St. Petersburg went on strike demanding an 8-hour working day, improved wages and working conditions. Their procession, led by Father Gapon, was attacked by the police and Cossacks when they reached the Winter Palace. Over 100 workers were killed and about 300 wounded. It was called the Bloody Sunday. The incident triggered strikes all over the country. People demanded a constituent assembly. Though the Tsar allowed formation of an elected consultative parliament or Duma during the 1905 revolution, he dismissed the first Duma within 75 days and re-elected a second Duma within 3 months. The First World War and the Russian Empire. The war was initially popular among people in Russia. They supported the Tsar, but when they refused to consult the main parties of the Duma, his popularity waned and anti-German sentiments caught up. The Russian army lost badly in Germany and Austria between 1914 and 1916. There were over 7 million casualties by 1917. The war badly impacted the industries. It created a shortage of labor, shutting down of small workshops and railway lines. The February Revolution in Petrograd. In 1917 winters, there was an acute shortage of food in the workers' quarters in Petrograd. On 22 February, a lockout took place at a factory. In sympathy, workers of 50 other factories declared a strike. Women led the strikes in some of these factories. The government imposed curfew to disperse workers surrounding the fashionable quarters and official buildings. On 25th February, the government suspended the Duma. In a violent protest on 27th February, people ransacked the police headquarters. The cavalry called out to control the situation refused to fire on the protesters. The same day, the striking workers and soldiers joined to form a Soviet or a council. This was the Petrograd Soviet. The very next day, the military commanders advised the Tsar to abdicate, which he did on 2nd March. A provisional government of Soviet leaders and Duma leaders was formed to run the country. After February, restrictions on public meetings and associations were lifted. Soviets were formed everywhere. Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin wanted the war to be ended, land be transferred to the peasants, and banks be nationalized. His 3 demands are called the April Theses. In industrial areas, factory committees started questioning the way industrialists ran their factories. Soldiers' committees were formed in the army. The power of the provisional government was declining, and Bolshevik influence was growing. Stern measures taken by the government against the Bolsheviks forced many Bolshevik leaders to go into hiding. The Revolution of October 1917. Lenin feared that the provisional government would set up a dictatorship. On 16 October 1917, Lenin convinced the Petrograd Soviet and the Bolshevik Party for a socialist seizure of power. A military revolutionary committee formed by the Soviet Leon Trotsky began the uprising on 24th October. Prime Minister Kerensky left the city to summon troops. Military men, loyal to the government, seized the buildings of 2 Bolshevik newspapers. Pro-government troops were sent to take over the telephone and telegraph offices and protect the Winter Palace. In retaliation, the committee ordered seizure of government offices and arrest of ministers. By nightfall, the city was taken over by the committee, and the ministers had surrendered. After heavy fighting, the Bolsheviks controlled the Moscow-Petrograd area by December. What changed after October? Most of the industries and banks were nationalized in November 1917. Land was declared to be social property. Bolsheviks forcibly partitioned large houses as per family requirements. New uniforms were designed for the officers and the army. The Bolshevik Party was renamed the Russian Communist Party, Bolshevik. In March 1918, the Bolsheviks made peace with Germany. In later years, Bolsheviks became the only party to participate in the elections to the All-Russian Congress of Soviets, which became the parliament of the country. Anyone who criticized Bolsheviks was punished. The Civil War. The non-Bolshevik socialists, liberals, and supporters of autocracy were critical of the Bolshevik uprising. They organized their troops to fight the Bolsheviks, the Reds. During 1918 and 1919, most of the Russian Empire was controlled by the Greens, socialist revolutionaries, and whites, pro-Tsarists. They found support in French, American, British, and Japanese troops. All these had fought a war with the Bolsheviks. By January 1920, the Bolsheviks controlled most of the former Russian Empire. In the name of defending socialism, Bolshevik colonists brutally massacred local nationalists in Khiva, Central Asia. It made the Bolsheviks unpopular. As a damage control measure, the non-Russian nationalists were given political autonomy in Soviet Union, USSR. This move, however, was only partially successful. Making a socialist society. Even during the Civil War, the Bolsheviks kept the banks and industries nationalized. They introduced a process of centralized planning. The officers made 5-year plans for economic development. Industrial growth was promoted in the first 2 plans, 1927-1932 and 1933-1938. Centralized planning led to economic growth. Industrial production increased manifold. However, rapid construction became a cause for poor living conditions of the workers. Their quarters lacked basic facilities like toilets, which were often built across the streets. Schools were developed for the workers' children, and arrangements were also made for factory workers and peasants to join universities. Factories established creches for children and women workers. Cheap healthcare was also provided to workers. Stalinism and collectivization. The period of early planned economy proved to be disastrous for the collectivization of agriculture. By 1927-28, there was an acute shortage of food grains in Soviet Russia. The peasants refused to sell their grains to the government buyers at the prices fixed by the government. Stalin, who headed the party at this time, introduced firm emergency measures. He believed that rich traders and peasants held stocks in the hope of raising prices later on. In 1928, he sent party members to the grain-producing areas to make grain collections and raid kulaks, well-to-do peasants. But it could not solve the grain crisis. In 1929, Stalin forced peasants to work on collective farms and share profits. The peasants did not take this step very well. Those who resisted Stalin's collectivization were severely punished, deported, or even exiled. Collectivization failed to increase production of food grain. Stalin ruthlessly suppressed any opposition to his policies. The global influence of the Russian Revolution and the USSR. By the time the Second World War started, the USSR had become the global face of socialism. Yet, by 1950s, the Russians realized that the government was not functioning in keeping with the ideals of the Russian Revolution. Industries and agriculture had developed and the poor were well fed, yet the citizens were denied basic freedom. The basic ideals of socialism were still respected in USSR. Many countries followed some ideals of socialism, but each country interpreted them in their own way. Summary. Let us summarize what we have learned. The French Revolution gave rise to three different schools of thought: the liberals, the radicals, and the conservatives in Europe. Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883, and Friedrich Engels, 1820 to 1895, favored a socialist society to eliminate capitalist exploitation. This would be a communist society. Russia and its empire was ruled by Tsar Nicholas II in 1914. The Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party was founded in 1898. The party split into Bolsheviks led by Lenin and Mensheviks over some difference of opinion. Parliament or Duma during the 1905 revolution. The Russian army lost badly in Germany and Austria between 1914 and 1916. On 27th February, the striking workers and soldiers joined to form a Soviet, or a council. This was the Petrograd Soviet. The Tsar abdicated on 2nd March. Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin put forward three demands, popularly called the April Theses. Bolsheviks were popular initially, but many supporters got disillusioned because of the censorship followed by the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks introduced a process of centralized planning which did lead to economic growth. Stalin's collectivization